Farrandal had loaded 11,000 crates through Meridian Gate in his short working life, and not one of them had ever tried to kill him. The 12,000th almost did. It came through on the manifest as agricultural sundries, stamped by a shipping consortium Farron had never heard of, routed from a system he couldn't find on any chart he'd ever used. That alone wasn't unusual. Half of what moved through Meridian Gate came from somewhere nobody could place, because the galaxy was old and full, and the trade lanes had a way of looping back on themselves through wormholes nobody bothered to name. What was unusual was that the crate hummed. Farron was a Kesu, which meant he was small, segmented, mostly patient, and paid by the container rather than the hour, which meant he did not have time to stand around listening to crates hum. He clipped his grav sled to the pallet, keyed the transponder, and got 2 meters into the transit corridor before the crate cracked itself open like an egg and dumped a very confused, very large, very human man onto the deck plating. "Oh," the man said, blinking up at the fluorescent strip lighting. "That's not the right gate." Farron's first coherent thought, in the language center that handled danger, was that he was going to be blamed for this. His second thought, in the language center that handled curiosity, which was smaller but louder, was that the man was wearing a uniform Farron didn't recognize, cut from a fabric that shimmered faintly gray-green like something alive, and that stitched over the breast was a symbol he did recognize because it was on half the ancient salvage that came through the station's antiquities market. An 8-pointed star wrapped in a ring, the old sigil people called, when they bothered to guess at all, the first flag of Earth. The man was human. Humans were common enough at Meridian Gate. Sol's current expansion cycle ran 3 species deep into the trade compacts, and Earth ships docked at the station twice a week. But this man's uniform was wrong. It was old wrong, not shabby wrong. It was the wrong-shaped wrong of something that predates the thing you thought was the original. "You're not supposed to be conscious," Farron said, which was not the most useful thing he could have said, but it was the truest. The man sat up, rubbed the back of his skull, and looked at Farron with an expression Farron would spend a long time afterward trying to describe to people who hadn't been there. Not fear, not the wariness he'd have expected from someone waking up among strangers on an alien station. Something closer to grief, arriving fast and being pushed back down just as fast. "How long?" the man said carefully. "Has it been since the second withdrawal?" Farron didn't know what the second withdrawal was. Nobody on shift that day did. It took 4 hours, a station security hold, 2 separate translator algorithms, and the arrival of an Earth diplomatic officer who went pale and then very quiet, for anyone to work out that the man's internal chronometer, a bio-implant, ancient tech, still ticking, was 3,140 years out of sync with galactic standard time. He'd been in cryosuspension inside a cargo crate for over 3 millennia, and he'd expected, when he woke, to still be able to reach Earth on an open comm channel. The Halcyon ward arrived 4 days later, which by the standards of Meridian Gate was fast enough to count as a scramble. Farron had never been aboard a human flagship. He had, in 11 years of dock work, seen exactly one from the outside. A courier-class vessel refueling at Bay 9, small and utilitarian, the kind of ship any competent species built. The Halcyon ward was not that. It came through the gate's outer ring under its own drive rather than requesting a tow line, which station traffic control considered either arrogant or a statement, and it was long and dark-hulled and quiet in a way that made every proximity sensor on the station read it twice, just to be sure. Farron found out later that flagship undersold it. The Halcyon ward was one of 9 vessels in what Earth called, with a bluntness Farron had come to associate with humans generally, the reclamation fleet. Ships built for exactly one purpose, which was going out into the dark where Earth's own history had gotten lost and bringing pieces of it home. because that was the thing about humans that the wider trade compacts had only started to piece together over the last century. The Earth everyone did business with, the Earth with its scrappy freighters and its disproportionately good engineers and its habit of turning up in places nobody expected, was not the first Earth. It was a remnant. 6,000 years ago, in what the archives, the ones that survived, called the first cycle, humanity had already been out among the stars, spread thin across 100 systems, trading, building, settling. And then something had happened, something big enough to sever the threads between all of it at once, and for 6,000 years the scattered pieces of humanity had simply not known the others existed. Earth itself had spent most of that time thinking it was alone in the universe. It had taken them until barely 2 centuries ago to claw back out to the stars a second time, this time with no memory of the first. And it was only in the last few decades, pushing outward, that they'd started finding the others. Lost colonies, isolated pockets, people who looked at a human ship's IFF transponder and wept because it meant somebody had finally come looking. The man Farron had uncrated, whose name turned out to be Corvin Adair, was one of them. A soldier of the first cycle, mothballed in an emergency stasis pod during, as best anyone could reconstruct, the final chaotic weeks of something called the Second Withdrawal, and then lost in transit for 3,000 years through a black market chain of buyers who had no idea what they were sitting on, each one selling the sealed antique cargo unit to the next for a modest profit, until it ended up rerouted through Meridian Gate on its way to a collector who'd wanted an interesting-looking crate for his warehouse. Captain Elena Voss came down to the detention bay personally to collect him, and Farron, who had been kept on station as a witness and who was starting to suspect witness, was doing a lot of work to avoid the word person we cannot yet let leave, got his first real look at her from across a security desk. She was compact, gray-streaked, and had the specific tiredness of someone who had been doing an impossible job for a long time and had made a private peace with never quite finishing it. "Mr. Dowell," she said, reading his name off a manifest slate, "I understand you're the one who opened the crate." "It opened itself," Farron said. "I was just standing near it when the universe decided to make that my problem." Something flickered at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but its close cousin. That tracks with most of what we find, actually. She glanced at Corvin, who was sitting very still in the corner with the expression of a man doing math he didn't like the answer to, and then back at Farron. "We'd like you to come aboard the ward. Briefly. Standard consult fee, standard indemnity, all above board. Meridian Gate Authority already signed off. We have questions about the supply chain that crate moved through, and you know this station's back channels better than my intelligence officer does after 4 days of trying." Farron's contract with the dock cooperative had a clause for exactly this kind of thing, buried on page 9, the kind of clause nobody ever expected to invoke. Third-party consult, extra-jurisdictional. It paid absurdly well precisely because nobody thought it would ever come up. He said yes before he'd finished thinking about it, which was unlike him, and which he would spend the rest of the episode blaming on curiosity getting the better of the part of his brain that handled danger. The Halcyon Ward's briefing room had a viewport instead of a screen, which Farron found unreasonably elegant for a warship, and a table around which sat people he would come to know rather better than he expected to that first day. Commander Thomas Reyes, the XO, built like a man who did his own hull maintenance and probably had with the specific patience of someone who'd long ago stopped being surprised by anything, and Dr. Amara Nkemelu, the ship's historian-linguist, who had the restless energy of someone who had spent her whole career waiting for exactly this kind of find and was visibly vibrating with the effort of staying professional about it. "Here's what we know," Amara said, and the star map over the table shifted to show a cluster of systems Farron didn't recognize, tagged in a coordinate system he didn't recognize either. Old Earth Cycle 1 navigation, he'd learn, not the modern galactic grid. Corvin's unit designation puts him with a garrison called Aldenreach Hold. First cycle colony. Minor system, nothing special according to any record we've got. A farming world, some light industry, maybe 40,000 people at peak population. It goes dark in the archives right around the start of the second withdrawal, along with about 60 other Cycle 1 systems in the same sector. All at once. No distress call, no wreckage field, nothing. Just gone from the record. And Corvin? Farron asked. Corvin remembers evacuation orders, Reyes said. Remembers loading civilians onto transports faster than his unit could process them. Remembers being told there wasn't room for combat personnel on the last ships out and volunteering for stasis instead of taking a seat that could go to somebody's kid. He said it flatly, the way you say something you've decided not to have feelings about in front of strangers yet. He remembers people saying the word devourers. Nobody's said that word to us in 6,000 years. We don't know what it means. We don't know if Aldenreach Hold still exists, or if the 40,000 people who lived there made it out, or where they'd have gone if they did. But you have a lead, Farron said, because the room had the specific quality of people who were about to ask him for something. Amara nodded. The crate you opened wasn't the first thing to surface from that chain of black market sales. Cargo like that, sealed, unmarked, mysteriously heavy, occasionally humming, tends to get flagged by collectors who like a good story, and collectors talk to each other. We traced 2 other pieces back through the same supply chain over the last year. Both antiques, both first cycle tech nobody could place. The star map zoomed, and a trade route lit up in soft gold, threading backward from Meridian Gate through 4 other stations before dead-ending at a waypoint with no station attached to it at all. Just a marker floating in open space at the edge of a system called Kessa's Fold. The chain terminates here. It's not a listed stop on any commercial route, but somebody's ships have been passing through it regularly enough to leave a wake in the traffic logs, and every single piece of Cycle 1 salvage we've traced leads back to the same dead end. You think that's Aldenreach, Farron said. I think, Amara said, that somebody has been quietly stripping a lost human colony for 6,000 years and selling the pieces off a crate at a time, and I would very much like to know if there's anybody still down there while they do it. They went. Of course they went. Farron would tell people later that he'd had a choice, technically, that his contract had a clean exit clause at the 48-hour mark, and every time he told the story he skipped a little faster over the part where he simply never used it. Kessa's Fold turned out to be a system nobody legitimate had filed a claim on in 3,000 years, which on the Trade Compact's books made it unclaimed and in every practical sense made it somebody's quietly. The waypoint marker resolved, on approach, into a debris field wrapped loosely around a rocky blue-green world with the unmistakable geometric scarring of old cities on its night side. Aldenreach, unmistakably the shape of it matching the 6,000-year-old survey charts Corvin had walked Amara through from memory, city by city, road by road, in a voice that got quieter every hour. And crawling over the debris field, running lights dark, engines throttled down to the barest hum needed to hold position, were 7 unmarked salvage ships. There, Reyes said, and the Halcyon Ward's sensor suite lit the 7 ships up in hostile orange, and every single person in the briefing room, Farron included despite having no formal reason to be there for this part, braced for exactly the confrontation the last 3 days had been building toward. The Devourers, whatever they were, whoever they'd become in 6,000 years, caught mid-harvest over the bones of the world they'd emptied. The salvage ships didn't run. They didn't fire, either. They opened a channel. The face that resolved on the comm display was human. Not first-cycle human in the way Corvin was, wearing an old uniform like a man out of time. This was a woman perhaps 60 years old by the look of her, weathered, dressed in patched work coveralls, sitting in a cockpit that looked cobbled together from 4 different centuries of salvaged parts. Behind her, through a viewport, Farron could see more of the debris field, and past it, impossibly heartbreakingly, lights. Not wreckage lights, city lights. Aldenreach wasn't a grave, it was a home, still lived in, still lit at night, hidden under 6,000 years of careful, deliberate silence. "You're flying an Earth military transponder," the woman said, before anyone on the ward had said a word, her voice carrying the flat, exhausted wariness of someone who had rehearsed this exact conversation in her head 1,000 times and hoped never to need it. "Which means you found one of our people out there, and which means you're here to reclaim us." She said the word like it tasted bad. "So before this goes any further, Captain, whoever you are, you should know that nobody on Aldenreach asked to be found, and the last time an Earth flag showed up in this sky, it was to leave 40,000 of us behind and never come back." The room went very still. "That's not—" Amara started, and the woman cut her off, sharp and tired. "I know what the records probably say. Evacuation. Heroic last transports. Everybody who could be saved was saved. Terrible tragedy. Nobody's fault." Her mouth twisted. "We were the ones who got left, so we remember it a little differently. And we've spent 6,000 years making sure nobody official ever found this rock again, because the last time somebody official knew where Aldenreach was, they abandoned it. And we were not about to give the next set of officials a second chance to decide we weren't worth the ships." Farron, who had spent the entire encounter braced for monsters, felt something in the room's tension shift into an entirely different and far more complicated shape. This wasn't a hunt for ancient predators picking over a corpse world. The 7 ships weren't looters. They were Aldenreach's own people, running their own black market salvage line, trading off pieces of their history for medicine, for parts, for whatever a hidden, cut-off colony needed to survive 3,000 years alone. Precisely because they'd decided that being found again was the actual danger. The threat everyone had spent 4 days bracing for, the Devourers, the vanished monster in the dark, wasn't out there at all. It had never been out there. The real fault line, the thing that had kept 60 systems worth of scattered, frightened people quiet for 6,000 years, was a far more human shape. The fear of being found by the very people who were supposed to have saved them, and weren't there when it mattered. Captain Voss was quiet for a long moment. Then she did something that Farron, small and segmented and very far from home, found he would remember for a long time afterward. She stood up from the command chair, so the woman on the other end of the channel could see her do it, and she said, "My name is Elena Voss. I don't have an answer for what happened here 6,000 years ago, and I'm not going to insult you by pretending I do. But I've got a soldier of yours aboard this ship who volunteered to stay behind so a transport could take more civilians, and he's spent 3,000 years asleep believing his whole world got out safe. I'd like to bring him home, if you'll let us dock. Nothing else has to happen today that you don't choose." The silence that followed was long enough that Farron found himself, absurdly, holding a breath he didn't strictly need to hold. Then the woman on the screen looked past the camera, at someone off to the side Farron couldn't see, and said something too quiet for the translator to catch. When she looked back, some of the flatness had gone out of her voice. "His name," she said. "Tell me his name first." "Corvin Adair," Reyes said. The woman's composure broke, just slightly, just at the edges. "Corvin," she repeated, and there was a whole history folded into the way she said it, a name that had clearly been spoken and mourned and remembered on Aldenreach for 6,000 years. "There's a memorial garden with his name on it. My grandmother used to take me past it. Said he gave up his seat for her mother. She pressed the heel of her hand briefly to her eyes, and when she spoke again her voice had steadied into something that sounded almost like disbelief, holding itself very carefully together. "You can dock. Slowly. And, Captain, you should know there are going to be a great many people down there with a great many hard questions for Earth. I'd start thinking about your answers now." Farandal was not, by trade or temperament, a person who ended up at the center of history. He loaded crates. He got paid by the container. He had, until 11 days ago, considered a good shift one where nothing hummed. But he stood on the Halcyon Ward's observation deck as the ship eased into orbit over a world that had spent 6,000 years convincing the universe it didn't exist, and watched the lights of a hidden human city glitter awake beneath them like something surfacing from very deep water, and he thought, not for the last time, though he didn't know that yet, that the trade lanes really did have a way of looping back on themselves if you gave them long enough. Behind him, he heard Corvin Adair's voice, rough with something that wasn't quite crying, asking Amara if the garden was still there. If anyone remembered. Somebody had. That, it turned out, was the whole and entire point. End of Episode 1. Next episode. With Alden Reach's trust cracked open but far from earned, the Halcyon Ward crew has to help broker first contact between a suspicious, self-sufficient lost colony and an Earth government that doesn't yet know 60 more worlds like it might be waiting in the dark, while Farron discovers that the black market salvage chain he helped uncover runs a lot further than one hidden system.